It all started one quiet Saturday morning. The air was crisp, and the sun was shining brightly as I sipped on a warm cup of coffee, savoring the peace that my new home had offered since I moved in. My property was located on the edge of a small neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, HOA. It was a beautiful, secluded place, a place where I thought I could escape the daily hustle and just enjoy my life. Little did I know, that peace wouldn't last long. At first, it was nothing more than a slight inconvenience. I had noticed a narrow strip of land at the edge of my property, which led into one of the streets of the HOA neighborhood. It wasn't a road, but it was clear enough that it resembled one. I thought maybe it was leftover from the previous owners or some sort of old access point. But over time, things began to get strange. Cars started driving down that path. I first thought it was a one-time occurrence, perhaps a neighbor lost in the area. But it wasn't a one-off. More cars kept turning onto my property, using this narrow strip of land as a shortcut into the neighborhood. Soon, it became a daily occurrence. Every morning, I'd see cars driving through my property like it was a public road. I would stand outside, wave my hands, trying to let them know that this wasn't a public road. I'd even try to speak to them when I had the chance, but most just ignored me, treating the situation like it was no big deal. The worst part? They acted like they had every right to be there. As days passed, my frustration grew. My property was not a public thoroughfare, but people were treating it like one. It was time to take action. I wasn't a confrontational person, but when I came home one evening to find a car turning too sharply onto the path, causing tire marks and tearing up the yard, that was it. The damage to my property was clear, and I couldn't let this continue. I immediately called the HOA, explaining what had been happening. I was hoping they would intervene, but when they told me that the strip of land wasn't under their jurisdiction, I was left speechless. They essentially said they couldn't do anything about it. It became obvious to me that I couldn't rely on the HOA to take action. This was my property, and I had every right to protect it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hired a contractor and had a sturdy gate installed, complete with a fence around the perimeter. I also posted "No trespassing" signs along the path. I wanted to make it clear to anyone who tried to use my property as a shortcut that this was private land, and trespassing would not be tolerated. I thought this would be the end of it, but it was only the beginning. Less than a week after the fence was up, I came home one Saturday afternoon to find a car parked right by my gate. I couldn't believe it. There, sitting in the driver's seat, was the most entitled woman I had ever met. Karen, as I later learned she was called, was blaring her horn and waiting for me to open the gate. When I stepped outside, she stormed over to me, her face twisted with anger. "Are you the one who put up this gate?" she demanded. "You need to open it now, I'm already late." Her tone was filled with disdain, and I could feel my blood boiling. Who did she think she was, telling me what to do on my own property? But it didn't stop there. As she ranted about how she had been using this path for years and that I had no right to block it, I stood my ground. I calmly explained that this wasn't a public road, it was my property, and I had every right to restrict access. She didn't like that answer one bit. Karen's face turned a shade of red I hadn't thought possible. "You'll regret this," she yelled. "The HOA will hear about this." I could feel the tension in the air. Karen wasn't just upset, she was furious. She whipped out her phone, probably calling the HOA or even the police. I wasn't sure what she expected to accomplish, but I wasn't backing down. I had done my homework, and I knew my rights. And then, it happened. She called the police. I could hardly believe it. This woman, trying to bully me into opening my gate, was now calling the authorities because I was standing up for my own property. When the police arrived, I wasn't nervous. I knew that I was in the right. The officer approached, clearly puzzled about the situation. "We got a call about someone blocking a road," he said, eyeing the gate. I calmly explained the situation. This is my property, I said, and I put up the gate because people were trespassing, using this path like it was a public road. This isn't a road, it's my land. I showed him the property map I had, pointing out the boundaries and proving that I was well within my rights. The officer seemed to understand, nodding as he spoke to Karen. She wasn't happy about it, of course, but the officer told her that the land was private property, and I had every right to block it off. But Karen wasn't done. As the officer walked away, she stormed back up to me, seething with rage. This isn't over, she hissed. I'll make sure the HOA takes action against you. You can't just block access to a road that's been used for years. I wasn't intimidated. I stood my ground. Go ahead, I said. But know this is my property, and if anyone tries to use it again, I'll call the police myself. As Karen walked away, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. I had stood up to her, and for now, I had won. But I knew this wasn't over. There would be more to come. The days following that confrontation were oddly quiet. I had hoped Karen would just accept the situation and move on, but I knew better. People like her didn't take no for an answer, especially when they felt entitled. Sure enough, about a week later, I received a letter in the mail from the HOA. I wasn't surprised, but I certainly wasn't happy to see it. The letter was formal, stating that the HOA was concerned about the fence I had put up. They referred to the strip of land as a public access point and demanded that I remove the gate immediately. The letter also warned that if I didn't comply, they would take further legal action. I sat there for a moment, reading the letter over and over. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The HOA had no right to control my property, this wasn't even a public road, and I had every right to restrict access. The HOA had tried to wash their hands of the situation when I initially called them for help, but now they were acting like they owned the land. It didn't make any sense. I decided to reach out to my lawyer just to make sure everything was in order. He assured me that I was in the right and that the HOA had no legal standing to force me to take down the gate. I was relieved, but I knew this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA wasn't the type to back down, and Karen, especially, wouldn't let it go. A few days later, I got another letter, even more aggressive than the first. This time, they stated that if I didn't comply with their demands, they would take me to court. The nerve! But I was ready. I knew that they had no real case, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me into giving up my rights. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. I made sure to document everything, photos of my property, the fence, and the no trespassing signs. I even had the map from the township to prove that the strip of land was part of my property, not public land. I wasn't going to let them take me down without a fight. Then came the day of the HOA meeting. I was anxious, but I knew I had done my homework. The meeting was scheduled to discuss my actions and the fence I had built. As I walked into the HOA office, I could feel the eyes of the board members on me. They were all sitting around a large table, looking at me like I was the villain in some neighborhood drama. The tension in the room was thick. At the head of the table sat Karen, her arms crossed in a self-righteous pose. She looked smug, as if she thought she had already won. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. I had my evidence ready, and I was going to stand my ground. The meeting started with the board president introducing the issue. He briefly explained that the fence was blocking access to what they referred to as a public road. Several neighbors had voiced concerns about the inconvenience caused by the blockade, and they wanted to find a solution. Karen jumped in quickly. "This affects all of us," she said, her voice rising with every word. "That shortcut is the most convenient way to get into our neighborhood. And now, because of this gate, we're stuck using the main road, which adds several extra minutes to our commute. I've been on this board for years, and we've never had any issues with this access point until now. I had heard enough. It was time to speak up. I raised my hand and waited for the president to acknowledge me. I stood up, feeling confident. I understand your concerns, I said, but the truth is, this isn't a public road. This is my private property, and I have every right to restrict access to it. It's not a shortcut, it's my land, and I don't want anyone using it without my permission. I could see Karen's face turning red. She wasn't happy with what I was saying, but I wasn't going to back down. I continued, if any of you had done your research, you would know that the HOA has no jurisdiction outside of its own boundaries. This is private property, and you have no legal claim to it. There was a long pause in the room. I could tell that some of the board members were starting to reconsider their stance. They looked at each other, murmuring under their breath. For a moment, I thought they might back off, but Karen wasn't ready to give up just yet. This is absurd, she shouted. Just because you have a piece of paper saying you own the land doesn't mean you can mess with everyone's lives. We've been using that shortcut for years. You're causing unnecessary trouble for everyone. The other board members started to murmur among themselves, but they seemed to be softening. One of them asked, "Are we sure this is even within our jurisdiction?" Another added, "I don't think we can force him to do anything if it's his property." Karen's expression changed. It was clear that the tide was turning in my favor. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. She stood up, slamming her hands on the table. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll take this to higher authorities, and you'll regret letting him get away with this." The board president raised his hand to calm the room. "I think we've discussed this enough for now," he said. "We'll need to review the legalities and talk with our attorney before making any further decisions. For now, it seems we don't have much choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It felt like a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Karen didn't look happy, and I could tell she was already planning her next move. But for now, I had won this round. Over the next few days, things got even more intense. Despite the small victory at the HOA meeting, I could tell Karen wasn't giving up. She wasn't the type to back down, and she had a way of making everything feel like a personal battle. It wasn't just about a road or a gate to her, it was about control. And I wasn't going to let her win. The following week, I received more letters from the HOA. Each one was more aggressive than the last. They insisted that I remove the gate and open the access point, claiming that the shortcut was crucial for the entire neighborhood. The tone of the letters was threatening, and they made it clear that they were prepared to take further legal action if I didn't comply. They even mentioned that they were consulting with their attorneys to see what legal steps they could take. I knew that I wasn't in the wrong. I had done everything by the book. I had checked with my lawyer, and I had made sure that my actions were completely legal. The land was mine, and no one, not even the HOA, had the right to tell me what to do with it. But Karen's influence within the HOA was strong, and I knew she was behind these letters, pushing for action. One afternoon, as I was reviewing the latest letter from the HOA, I decided to take a more proactive approach. I wasn't going to let them scare me into giving up my rights. I began preparing for the next step. If Karen and the HOA thought they could bully me, I would make sure everyone knew the truth. I started gathering more evidence, including footage from my security cameras that showed Karen's earlier outbursts and the cars that had been using my property as a shortcut. I also reached out to my neighbors, those who had been using the path before the fence went up. Surprisingly, some of them apologized and promised they would never use it again. Others, however, seemed a bit more indifferent. Still, at least I wasn't entirely alone in this. I had the support of a few neighbors who understood the situation and knew that what I was doing was right. It wasn't long before I received another call, this time from my lawyer. Karen had decided to escalate things further. She had contacted her own lawyer and was planning to take me to court. She was claiming that the HOA had authorized the strip of land as a public access point and that I had violated some sort of community easement by blocking it with my gate. I couldn't believe it. The HOA had no such authorization, and there was no easement in place. I had made sure of that. But Karen wasn't backing down. Her persistence was starting to wear on me. I wasn't prepared to waste my time and money on a lengthy legal battle, but I knew I had to do something to protect myself. That's when I had an idea. I reached out to a local news station that specialized in property rights and HOA issues. I sent them a brief outline of the situation, along with photos of the property and the letters from the HOA. I figured if I could bring attention to this issue, it might put pressure on Karen and the HOA to back off. To my surprise, the news station responded almost immediately. They were interested in covering the story, and a few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, explaining how the HOA had been overstepping its bounds. During the interview, I made sure to emphasize that I had followed all the proper legal channels and that I was simply trying to protect my private property. I also discussed how the HOA had ignored residents' concerns in the past and prioritized their own agenda over the needs of the community. The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. People started reaching out, offering their support. The more I explained the situation, the more people realized just how ridiculous the HOA's claims were. The next week, Karen called me again. This time, however, there was a noticeable difference in her tone. She wasn't as forceful as before, and her usual arrogance was replaced with a hint of uncertainty. "I saw the news," she said, sounding almost apologetic. "I realize now that I may have overreacted." She went on to admit that after seeing the coverage, some of her neighbors had spoken out against her and the HOA's tactics. Karen confessed that the HOA had no real claim to the land and that she had been too aggressive in trying to force me to remove the gate. She even apologized for the way she had treated me. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. This wasn't the Karen I had dealt with just a few weeks ago. While I wasn't about to forgive her completely, I could tell that she had realized the error of her ways. It was a strange turn of events, but it seemed like the situation was finally winding down. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The constant pressure, the legal threats, and the ongoing conflict were taking their toll, but now it seemed like it was finally over. The following day, I received a formal letter from the HOA. To my surprise, it was an apology. The HOA acknowledged that they had overstepped their bounds and confirmed that they would no longer pursue any action against me. They also issued a reminder to the residents that they needed to respect private property and avoid trespassing. Karen, according to the letter, had been advised to step down from the board. It felt like a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had been bullied by an HOA in the past. I had stood my ground, and in the end, my rights were respected. The road was still blocked, the gate was still up, and my property was finally safe from intruders. For the first time in a long while, I could honestly say I felt at peace with my property. After the news coverage and the apology from the HOA, things seemed to settle down, but I knew I couldn't relax just yet. I had been through too much, and I wasn't going to let my guard down. It was strange, though. After everything that had happened, there was a calmness that followed. The HOA didn't send any more aggressive letters, and Karen had disappeared from the scene. It felt like I had won the battle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lingering in the background. I continued to monitor the situation closely. I checked the security cameras every day to make sure no one was attempting to trespass on my property. The occasional car would pass by, but no one dared to drive through the path anymore. My neighbors, who had once used the shortcut, had either stopped or apologized for their past actions. I felt a sense of peace knowing that the issue was resolved, but I also couldn't help but wonder if Karen and the HOA would try something again in the future. As the weeks went on, I began to move on from the ordeal. Life started to return to normal, and I was finally able to enjoy the peace and quiet of my property again. I felt secure, knowing that I had taken the necessary steps to protect my land. The HOA had backed down, Karen had been dealt with, and I was no longer worried about people using my property without permission. I had stood up for myself and my rights, and it felt good to know that I had won. But then, one day, I received another letter from the HOA. It was nothing like the previous letters. It wasn't aggressive, nor was it threatening. Instead, it was a simple reminder of the HOA's rules and regulations. The letter mentioned that the residents had been reminded to respect the property lines, and that any further disputes would be handled according to the law. It seemed like a final attempt to put everything behind them. I laughed as I read the letter. After everything that had happened, I knew they weren't going to try anything else. The HOA had learned its lesson, and they were no longer trying to control my property. I didn't take the letter too seriously, but I kept it for the record. It was just another piece of evidence that proved I had stood my ground and won. One thing that I did find interesting was that Karen's name had been removed from the HOA board. According to the letter, she had been advised to step down. I didn't know the full details, but it was clear that her overreach had finally caught up with her. The board members who had once been hesitant to back me up had now seen the situation for what it really was. They understood that Karen had been acting out of line, and they had no choice but to distance themselves from her. The whole experience had been a roller coaster ride, full of tension, frustration, and legal battles. But in the end, it taught me a valuable lesson. I had learned about the power struggles that can arise when people try to impose their will on others, especially when it comes to property rights. I had learned to stand up for myself, to be firm when necessary, and to not back down in the face of adversity. Looking back, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had taken control of my situation, and I had come out victorious. The road was still blocked, my gate was still in place, and my property was secure. I had protected what was mine, and that was something I could be proud of. But even though things had quieted down, I still found myself occasionally wondering about the people who had tried to take advantage of my land. I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of a car driving down the main road, and I'd wonder if they ever regretted using that shortcut. I'd think about the neighbors who had used it before, and whether they had learned to respect my property rights. The one thing I was certain of, however, was that no one would ever take my property from me again. I had fought for it, and I had won. No matter what happened in the future, I knew I had the strength to stand up for what was mine. And that was all I needed. As time went on, the situation with Karen and the HOA seemed like a distant memory. The once frequent worry of people trespassing on my property faded into the background. My life began to feel normal again, free from the constant stress and tension that had clouded my days before. The peace that had seemed so fragile was now something I could finally enjoy without fear of someone trying to undermine it. I still received the occasional question from neighbors who had used the path before, but for the most part, they had accepted the new reality. They understood that the shortcut was no longer an option and that I wasn't going to budge on my decision to block access. Some had even apologized, admitting that they didn't realize how important it was for me to maintain control over my land. That made me feel better, knowing that at least some of them had learned a valuable lesson about respecting others' property. The HOA, for the most part, seemed to have moved on to other matters. After the apology letter, there was no further interference. I didn't hear from them again, and I knew that I had successfully defended my rights. The board members, especially those who had been unsure about their position before, now seemed to understand the boundaries of their authority. They no longer treated my property like it was public land, and I was able to live without the constant fear of further challenges. But there was one thing that still lingered in my mind: Karen. Though she had stepped down from the HOA board, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her. The last time I had seen her, she was full of rage and entitlement, convinced that she could bully me into submission. Now, she was gone from the scene, but I wondered if she had learned anything from the situation. Had she realized that there were consequences to her actions? Or would she continue to push the boundaries with someone else? I may never know the full story, but what mattered was that I had stood my ground. I had fought for my property, for my rights, and for the peace I deserved. The road that once felt like a constant source of stress and conflict was now just a memory, a reminder of how far I had come. I no longer had to worry about people treating my property like a shortcut, and I was finally able to live my life without interference. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It had been a long, tough battle, but I had won. I had learned a lot about myself, about property rights, and about standing up to those who try to take advantage of you. In the end, my property was secure, and I was at peace. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you've protected what is rightfully yours. It's not always easy, and it's not always a smooth road, but when you stand firm in your beliefs and fight for what's right, you can achieve something truly special. For me, that victory was worth every ounce of effort. Now, when I look out at my property, I see not just a patch of land, but a symbol of my resilience and determination. I know that no one will ever take it from me again. And that, in itself, is a victory that I will cherish forever.